Now, our speaker today, Sara Allen, who I'm very excited to introduce to all of you because I know some of you are big fans of Sara's and you attend her DNA programs. This is not a DNA program, so it's kind of exciting for her to share what other information she knows. So Sara she started researching her family history when she was 11 years old. She has a master's degree in library and information science from Dominican University. Now, Sara has been here since 2013, but before that, she was a genealogy librarian and the assistant manager of local and family history services at the St. Joseph County Public Library in South Bend. So she has a lot of great information to share with all of you, and I'm super excited for her to hop on.
So today we're going to talk about finding the unknown parents of your 19th century ancestors. And some of the things I'm going to talk about will be applicable to 20th century or 18th century, but the examples that I give are mostly 19th century, and that's why we titled it that. Some people had asked whether this talk was about adoption, and it is not about adoption per se, and it may not be very applicable if you are a 20th century or 21st century adoptee. We have done some programs on adoption in the past. They're on our YouTube channel, and I think Elizabeth is going to post those into the chat for you to kind of link to those and see those. So hopefully that will be of help to you today. And we're not, as Elizabeth said, we're not explicitly going to talk about DNA either today, although I might mention it in passing a couple places. Now, another couple housekeeping things. Your handout today has a lot more detail about research methods and techniques that I will mention in the program today. So I'm going to kind of skim over explanations in the program, but know that there is an extensive discussion of direct and indirect evidence and the genealogical proof standard and those types of things in your handout, as well as some little descriptions of types of records that you might use to try to help you to identify relationships in your family history. So that's all in the handout. So if I kind of skim by something in the talk, it's probably in the handout. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about those little pesky brick walls that all of us encounter in our genealogical research after, we're going along, really well for a while, and we get back to like a third grade grandmother, and we suddenly can't find anything else about her. We know she's married to our third great grandfather, but we don't know who her parents might have been. We don't know where she came from. We don't know exactly when she was born, and we just kind of draw a blank on this person. So today's talk is really going to be about how can you get back past those kind of brick walls. And so let's go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing I want to show you is these are just my own personal research tips here. And so just off the top, I thought I'd mention them. This is how I do my research. I look everywhere. Number one, I seek expert advice when needed. Number two, and number three, I never, ever give up. So looking everywhere just basically means you're wanting to look at a variety of the applicable online sources that would be available for this particular research question, whatever it is that you're working on, and the print resources that are in print and available. And then you're going to have to make visits or phone calls or emails to applicable record repositories, because we know much material is still not online. So archives, libraries, and courthouses in the area where your family lived. Then seek expert advice. If you live in Maine and you are not familiar with Texas, but that's where you're researching a problem in Texas, you may need to contact some kind of local expert in Texas to tell you about Texas history, to tell you about Texas research techniques, special situations that might exist there in Texas, and so forth. So don't be afraid to do that. That might be the answer that gets you over this hump in your research. If you are US based but your ancestors come from a foreign country, as all of ours do at some point or another, and you start to get yourself back into that foreign country and you're unfamiliar with that country, you're unfamiliar with the language, you're unfamiliar with the customs, you're unfamiliar with the genealogical records that might exist in that country, you need to, again, connect yourself with an expert in that country or an expert with that type of research to help you, especially if you're at a brick wall situation. And then never, ever give up. By that, I just mean, that means lots of things, but it means, new records are being added to the online databases daily. So Ancestry, MyHeritage, Find My Past, Family Search, they add new records daily. They add new information to their sites daily. So you searched it yesterday, you searched Ancestry yesterday. Today, when you search, a completely new record could be found on there. So you want to redo your searches over and over again in these different databases. New books are being published every day. People are still publishing print books and ebooks on genealogy. And people are still discovering lost records, possibly in their attic or their basement, and they're making those available to researchers also. So just never, ever give up. That's my last tip for you about how I do my research. Now, let's move on to direct and indirect evidence. And like I said, this is in your handout in a lot more detail. But basically, the people who contact us a lot of times will ask us for, say, a birth certificate for their ancestor. And we ask them, where did your ancestor live and what time period? So what's location and what time period? And a lot of times people are seeking a birth certificate from the 1700s or the 1800s. And we have to tell them, no, the state that you're looking at or the country that you're looking at didn't keep government civil birth certificates until the 20th century. So you're not going to be able to find a birth certificate for your ancestor. And then they ask us a follow-up basically, which is, well, how am I going to prove who my ancestor was, when they were born, where, and who their parents were? And I say, well, you're going to have to find the answer in a different source, not in a birth certificate, obviously. So a birth certificate would be a piece of direct evidence that directly and explicitly answers the research question of where and when your ancestor was born to the named parents. And if you find an original birth certificate, that is a piece of good evidence that this is, the right person, the right place, the right time, the right parents. But when we get back into the 19th century, 18th century genealogy research, like I said, you're not going to find a birth certificate for most states for those time periods. So how else can you prove that who the parents are of your ancestor? Well, you're going to have to look at pieces of indirect evidence. So indirect evidence is a relevant piece of information that suggests a possible answer to your research question. So an example would be the 1850 census, where you might find what appears to be a man, a woman, and their possible children together in a household. Now, the 1850 census doesn't tell you the relationship of those people in the family. It just tells you that they're living in a household together. So you can't say for sure that this is a set of parents and their biological children, but it suggests that that might be the case. So that would be one piece of indirect evidence that you could use to say, this is possibly my ancestor's parents. But you'd want to get some more pieces of indirect evidence that confirm that. So proving a relationship when there's no direct evidence involves using multiple different pieces of indirect evidence about the relationship and building a case or an argument for that relationship. And you want to use the genealogical proof standard to kind of guide you. And that information about that is in your handout. So today, I'm going to touch on a variety of different sources and record types to illustrate my examples that I give you, my case studies. But these are just the tip of the iceberg. The records that are listed on this slide are just really the tip of the iceberg. And you really need to familiarize yourself with so many different kinds of records beyond just the census. Sure, look at the census. That is a great place to start. But other types of records are so rich in their detail, in their composition, and in the kinds of clues that you can find. If you can find other types of records beyond the census, you really could strike gold. So if you're kind of at a point where you don't know what types of records to look at next, find yourself a research checklist, somewhat like the one that I'm showing on screen here. I found this just by Googling, and you can see the URL where I got it. It was from the Capital Area Genealogical Society website. And look at that list. There's got to be, 75 different distinct types of records that you might find about an individual ancestor. So if ever you get really stuck and think that you have looked everywhere, get out a research checklist like this, and then you'll get some more ideas. You'll get new ideas for new places to look. All right, so building a case, this is again in your handout in great detail, but each record that you find, each piece of indirect evidence that you find provides a clue for you to look for further records, different records perhaps. And you're continuing to follow those clues to build your case for reaching a sound genealogical conclusion. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today in the 3 case studies. Now, the 3 case studies are basically incomplete. I have not brought them to completion by writing a genealogical proof standard argument, a proof argument. I haven't done that. But what I'm really doing in the case studies is showing you kind of how you would go about it. So each case study starts out with a person whose parents are unknown. And by the end of the case study, we have proposed a set of parents for that person. And we've come, pretty far in proving it in a couple of the cases. So at least you have somewhere to go. Whereas before you were completely clueless about who the parents might have been. So I'm just kind of getting you started with how to do this and how to kind of build your proof as you go along. And hopefully these case studies will be interesting to you. I found them very interesting. 2 of them are not from my family and 1 of them is from my family. So I'll tell you which one at the time. So case study number 1 is about a guy named Lorenzo Clark. He was born around 1817 in Pennsylvania, and he was married to a woman named Catherine Emick. The family that was telling me about this told me that they could not find a marriage record. One of the things I said to them was, where have you looked for the marriage record? Have you looked have you thought about the idea that this marriage record may not be online yet? So you might need to call some courthouses. You might need to do some in-person research there in Ohio where you suspect the marriage took place. So this couple is found together in the census in Seneca County, Ohio in 1850. And then from there, they moved on to Fountain County, Indiana. So the research question is, who were Lorenzo's parents? That's what the patron that came into the library asked me. How do I find out who Lorenzo's parents were? So basically the earliest time period, and this is what I always suggest to people, the earliest time period that this person had found Lorenzo Clark was in the 1850 census. And so I tell people, really double down on that first place of residence that you find for him or her, and really do a good search for other people named Clark in the county, other people with the wife's last name, Amick or Emick, and then look at the fan club. So the fan club is an acronym. It stands for Friends, Associates, and Neighbors. Friends and family, associates, and neighbors. So who did Lorenzo hang out with in Seneca County, basically, to use a modern vernacular? And can you link any of those people to being family members of his or his wife's at this point, since we don't know anything about her either? The family that was talking to me, they hadn't done a lot of fan club research into Seneca County. So that was one of the assignments I gave them. I said, well, you know, and then when they moved to Fountain County, you need to be working on the fan club there as well as thoroughly researching Lorenzo, his wife, and his children to try to get clues about where they lived prior to 1850 and where they might have come from and who their family members might have been, their extended family members. In looking at the 1850 census in Seneca County, we found no Clarks or Amics nearby. Now, I like to look at least 20 names before and 20 names after, but sometimes you need to investigate the entire township for looking at the neighbors, or and also the entire county for people of the same last name, even though that might seem very tedious. If you have no other clues to go on, then these are your major clues at this point, is trying to link them to some other people named Clark or Amick. Now, like I said, we didn't find anybody really that stood out to us when we were looking at the neighbors. They'd have to do some extensive digging into those people. So I decided, I was still, talking to this person here at the library. And so I decided to go in a different direction. And I said, well, have you looked for other Lorenzo Clarks in Ohio? What about 1840 census? And so they said, well, we found somebody in the 1840, but we don't know whether that's the same person or not. So in 1840, we do find a Lorenzo Dow Clark. He is not in Seneca County. He's in Delaware County, and he's in Westfield Township. He's the only person of that name in the state in the 1840 census index. Now, given that Lorenzo would have been about 23 at that time period, he could have been living with his folks in a census, in which case he wouldn't be listed in the census index, because the index at the 1840 census is indexing the head of household only. But if Lorenzo from Seneca County was living on his own in 1840, then this guy could be him. He's the right age. You can see down at the bottom there. Well, it might be covered by something. I'm sorry about that. But Lorenzo is the very bottom line. And you can see there's only one person. There's one tick mark. So there's one person in that household, and it's a male, and he's aged 20 to 29. Now, in this census, in looking at the 20 names before and the 20 names after, we come across somebody also named Clark who lives who's basically 3 names away. So we've got a Sally Clark who's age 40 to 49. And then she has a number of children in her household, probably her own biological children, but we cannot say that for sure based on this information alone. So at this point, we've got a guy that could be the same guy who was in Seneca County in 1850, but we don't know that for sure. But this is the only clue we have right now. So we have to keep following it. What can we find out about this Lorenzo Clark in Delaware County and this Sally Clark who lives nearby? So you always want to look at a map and just kind of map out where people are living. And you can see that Seneca and Delaware County are not far away. However, there's 10 years between the 1840 and 1850 census. And so people could have moved all the way across the country in that amount of time, or from a foreign country. So a lot can happen in 10 years. But it's always good to just keep an eye on the map and know where all the different locations that keep popping up are located. So Sally Clark, remember, we're looking at her, and we're looking at the Lorenzo. We're looking at Sally and Lorenzo from Delaware County. We can't find Lorenzo from Delaware County in 1850. So he's disappeared. He's not in Delaware County. He's not in Morrow County, which is the county that was formed out of Delaware County. He possibly could have, so when someone disappears out of a census, usually they either moved or they passed away, they died. Or, you know, they could be, you know, off in jail or something like that, changed their name, gone underground. And that happens, not frequently, but that does happen. So Lorenzo, who was living near Sally, has disappeared. We don't know where he's gone, but Sally's still there. So we can see that Sally is born in Pennsylvania, and she's now listed in Morrow County. But this is because Morrow County was formed out of part of Delaware County. And so I don't think Sally moved necessarily because she's still in Westfield Township. I also found a find a grave for Sally. And with the find a grave, we get Sally's husband's name, which is William Clark. And it looks like they might be on the same stone. There's not a picture here, but it kind of implies that. And they're buried in Westfield Township. And we can see that William died in 1835. So then, knowing that there are many more records created about men at this time period, rather than women, we can research William Clark in the hopes that there'll be some records about him that shed some light on his family, who his children might have been, and so forth. So we could find William in 1830. Fortunately, this family was not moving every other day to a different location. They were kind of located there in Westfield Township for quite a while. So in 1830, 5 years before his death, we've got William Clark in Westfield Township. He is aged 40 to 49, and he's got a number of children in his household, including a number of male children. They're probably his own children. We've got a male 10 to 14, and we've got a male 15 to 19. Either one could be the Lorenzo Dow Clark that lived next door to Sally in Delaware County in 1840. And either one could be the Lorenzo that we're looking for that was in Seneca County. So he's the right age to have a son that age. And he's got some sons in his household that could have been born around 1817. So this is interesting news, but it's not, you know, we're still building a case. We're building on each piece of information that we find. So then we know that William died in 1835. Might there be a will for him? Now, we're very lucky because Ancestry and Family Search have done a lot of digitizing wills from Ohio specifically. I've noticed this. They haven't digitized every will in the whole United States or the whole world for that matter. So a lot of times you're going to have to look offline for a will record. And a will record is only one of the probate records that would exist. But we were lucky in this case. 1835 will of William Clark of Delaware County, Ohio was found. And it gives a list of children. And you may or may not be able to read it. So I have transcribed the names of the children. He has a child named Lorenzo Dow. He has a son, and then he has Jasper Wood, William Perry, Malvina, Watson Norris, Madison Bailey, and Matilda Bunker. Real interesting names and good for keeping track of these people because there's just not a lot of Madison Bailey Clarks out there, for instance. So based on this, I think we can clearly say that the Lorenzo Clark that was found living 3 houses away from Sally was the son of Sally and William. So we've established that based on this will. That very few people named Lorenzo Dow Clark in Ohio in general. So the one in Delaware County has to be the son of this couple. Now, we still have not determined whether these 2 men were the same person. So are the 2 men named Lorenzo Dow Clark that we found, the one in Delaware County and the one in Seneca County, are they the same person? We have circumstantial evidence. We have found 2 men with the same name that are similar in age, and they're in the same general area of Ohio. And we cannot find them both in the same census. For instance, we found one of them in 1840, but not the other one. And we found one of them in 1850, but not the other one. So if we had found both of them in the same census, then we would know that they were two separate men. So at this point, we still are unclear, and we're going to need more than circumstantial evidence. So what else can we do further? Well, right now we are still running down this road of thinking, well, maybe they're both the same man. The guy from Delaware County is the same guy that moved to Seneca County, that moved to Fountain County. That's what we're hoping is true. We're trying to figure that out, right? And so we're still looking at this family from Delaware County. So we need to do a deep dive into the lives of William and Sally Clark and their fan club. So really work on this family in Delaware County to rule them in or rule them out. So William and Sally, we've already got the list of their children from William's will. And then look at their grandchildren. You can find those in census records as the children grow up and get married. And can you connect any of these people? And it's going to be a large family. You saw that they had about 8 children. William and Sally had about 8 children. Can you connect them with the Seneca County and Fountain County Clarks at all? So I'm still talking to this person at the library who came in with this question. And I just started clicking around. Remember that William and Sally's kids had unusual names. So I started to click around and I came across this record about Watson Norris Clark. So he is one of the sons of William and Sally. And he was named in the will of William. And he's a possible sibling of Lorenzo, right? And Watson had an unfortunate happenstance here. He met an unfortunate end. Foul play, says the article. He's from Ohio, according to this article. He was found dead in Indianapolis, Indiana. And why was he in Indianapolis, Indiana? Well, the article at the very bottom says that he was en route to Fountain County, and it's implied that that's Indiana, to visit his son and daughter. So our Lorenzo that we started out looking at moved to Fountain County, Indiana, right? So I think now we have one piece of indirect evidence that's linking the two families. We've got, the two brothers possibly, being connected up through this Fountain County article that we found. That's only one piece of indirect evidence. So we've not proved this case at all, but I think we're on a really good start. We've made a really good start. And the things that I suggested that the patron continue to do would be to investigate this further, accumulate more pieces of indirect evidence. Who were these children of Watson Clark that lived in Fountain County? When did they live? When did they move there? Where did they live exactly in Fountain County? Can you find them in the fan club of Lorenzo Clark of Fountain County? Can you find the two families interacting while they were living in Fountain County? If so, that would be another piece of indirect evidence to say, yes, these families were associated with each other. They knew each other. They are probably associating with each other because Lorenzo is their uncle, is what I would guess. But there's more work to be done. And then there's all those other siblings of Watson Clark, and there's more work to be done on William and Sally, really. And then working on the fan club of Lorenzo in Fountain County. But I think that this can probably be proven with just a little more research. So I hope that that was helpful to you. Okay, let's move on to our next case study. This one is my own family. And so this is about William Graves, who's my 4th great grandfather. He was born around 1784 and died around 1860. I'm calling him William Graves the Younger to try to differentiate him between another William Graves that we're going to run across in this case study. So my William Graves was married to a woman named Catherine Richmond in 1811 in Sumner County, Tennessee. He served in the War of 1812, and no record found about him has indicated the names of his parents, and that is our research question for the day. We do have 2 possible brothers that were identified. Jacob Graves was identified as a possible brother because he lived next door to William and he served in the War of 1812 in the same company. And they were frequently, the two families were frequently listed together in different situations. So they're definitely part of each other's fan clubs, William and Jacob, and they were around the same age as well. And then there was a Frederick Graves, who was also around the same age, but I didn't know very much about him because he did not live next door and he did not serve in the War of 1812 that we know of. There were just some family stories that said that he was the brother. So another great possibility for research is when you've researched your person extensively. So I feel like I have researched William Graves's life very extensively. And yet I cannot find a trace of who his parents might have been. But I have these two guys that are probably his brothers. Don't know for sure, but probably his brothers. I need to research them just as extensively. And if I can unearth the name of Jacob Graves's parents or Frederick Graves's parents, this will probably lead me to William Graves's parents. So does everybody see that? So when I started researching with the idea of really researching in on these two brothers, I thought about the War of 1812. And so I knew that William had had a pension for the War of 1812, and I wondered if Jacob did as well. So the pensions have been put onto Fold 3 relatively recently for the War of 1812. And I'm not certain that they're entirely complete, but they were complete for Tennessee and the names that I was looking for. William and Jacob were deceased before the pensions were offered, but their widows were still living. And so the widows would have applied for the pension on the service of their deceased husbands. And for a widow to be approved for a pension, she had to prove that she was actually married to the soldier and that her husband actually did have military service, as she is saying that he did in the appropriate war. And so the widows would bring all of these witnesses. Basically, they had to produce all these people witnessing and giving statements, basically saying, yes, this couple was married. She'd have to provide her marriage record if she could, the official marriage record. And she'd have to have affidavits of men who served in the same company who could say, yes, I was in that company and William Graves was in that company, et cetera, et cetera. So anyways, William Graves's widow, in her pension application, one of her witnesses was actually Frederick Graves. And this is the guy that's supposed to be the brother. So this would be her brother-in-law, if we have the relationship correct. So Frederick Graves comes forward and he says in 1871, he says he's 81 years old. He was present at William and Catherine's marriage around 1808. He was acquainted with them both prior to the marriage. Okay, so this is good. And then Jacob Graves' widow also has to provide some statements from witnesses. And one of hers is from Christina Graves, who was the wife of Frederick Graves. So Christina says she's 76 years old in 1871. She's acquainted with Jacob and Catherine Graves since before their wedding, and she was present at their wedding. So now we have linked the three brothers kind of closely together because they're all providing witness statements for each other so that they can get their pension. And I'm feeling, and they're basically also attesting that they have known each other virtually all their lives and that they were at each other's weddings. So this is all good as far as making my case that these three are probably brothers. There were no other Graves families in that area, I should say. It's a kind of an uncommon name in that area of Tennessee until these brothers moved there. So now I'm going to show you this because this is going to explain to you why I didn't research Frederick for a long time. So Sumner County is on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. And my William, remember, was from Sumner County. And so I had done a lot of research in Sumner County, and Jacob, his brother, had been in Sumner County. So I had researched him also in Sumner County. Frederick lived in Kentucky. And I guess I was just too lazy to, for a while there, I was a little too lazy to just kind of get myself into another county there. But as you can see, the two counties adjoin each other. So it was really kind of silly of me to have neglected Frederick for so long, because I'd been beating my head against the wall trying to figure out who William's parents were. So when I decided to start researching Frederick, what I found out was that he was from Allen County, Kentucky, like I said, and Allen County, Kentucky courthouse had actually burned. And so most of the county records had been lost, which is a complication, of course. So I was kind of doing your usual thing of looking online, trying to find trees, trying to find other people researching. And I actually found somebody who had posted online a tree for Frederick. And this was years and years ago. And she had his parents down as William and Elizabeth. And I thought, well, you know, you can see all kinds of trees with names of parents. But I wrote this lady, and she actually wrote me back, and she said, well, you need to look at the tax records. And I said, tax records? And I was a newer genealogy at that point, or a newer genealogist at that point, and I wasn't very familiar with tax records and how they might be used. And so I said, okay. And she said, that's where we got the information. So basically, what we found out is that Frederick Graves has been taxed for land in Allen County, Kentucky, that originally had been taxed to other people named Graves, William and Elizabeth. And that's where they got the theory that William and Elizabeth would be his parents. So the land records have burned, like I said, but the tax records did survive because they were held in Frankfurt and in the state capital. And so that didn't burn. So being that the tax records have survived, let's go ahead and investigate this. And I have kind of really simplified this down to a couple of slides here, but it's actually kind of complicated story. But basically, Frederick Graves is found in 1829 on the Allen County tax list. And I have put the abstract over there on the screen. I looked at the originals, and you always want to look at the originals. You don't want to take the abstract as the final say. You want to make sure that you've eyeballed the original record and that you agree with what the abstract is saying that it says. But those original records would not show up on this PowerPoint presentation that I have today. Basically, they're dark, they're scratched, they're very hard to read. So we're going to go with the abstracts. So on this abstract in 1829, we find Frederick Graves is being taxed for 135 acres on the Middle Fork of Drake's Creek. And it says patent, or it says P.W. Graves, which stands for patented by William Graves. So this is a clue that something's going on here. Now, basically, when you're in the tax records, you want to follow the names of the people, but you also want to follow the description of the property. So this 135 acres on the Middle Fork of Drake's Creek. And I had to look at the front of this abstract book, and it told me that M Fork stands for Middle Fork. So there's some abbreviations used there, but you're following the description of the land. And you're also just following the location, and you're also following the waterway if they're giving one, and the name of the person in the tax records year by year, trying to see when something changes. So we're going back in time now. So in 1824, something changes. So in 1824, Frederick's not listed on the tax record anymore. But Elizabeth Graves is listed. And what is the description of her land? It's 135 acres on the Middle Fork of Drake's Creek. So this is the same land description. probably, and it probably is the same land. So then we go back to when it changes again. In 1819, we can see that there's an appearance of William Graves, and I'm going to call him the older. So he's a different William Graves than my fourth great grandfather that I was looking into. This is a different guy, so we're calling him William the Older. And you can see that on this tax list, Elizabeth is not mentioned. Frederick is not mentioned. Only William. And the description of the land is the same, 135 acres, Middle Fork, Drake's Creek. And it also says that there's a patent on this land. And so that's a record that you can look into for Kentucky. The Kentucky land patents are held at the Secretary of State's office, and you can order them online. Okay, so when does William first show up on these lists? Well, we have to go back to 1807. And in 1807, that same land is in Warren County, Kentucky. And so you have to know that as well. And you can see that there's actually a Frederick listed here, and I don't know who that is. It's probably not Frederick, the other Frederick that we were talking about, but this is the only time that he appears on this early 1807 list. But there is William, and William is on Drake's Creek, and it says that he got his land from David Watkins. And so this is probably indicating when this land was purchased, or around the time period that this land was purchased. So what have we learned from this? We have learned that William Graves was the first one to own this land around 1807, and this is William the Older. And at some point he obtained a patent for this land, and we can send for this patent, which I have done from the state of Kentucky. Between 1819 and 1824, he dies, and his widow Elizabeth inherits the same land and is taxed on it. Now we know this because women didn't own land at this time period, and really only a widow would be able to own this land at this time at this state. And you'd want to look into the rules of women's rights and inheritance and so forth, whatever state it is that you're looking at or locality that you're looking at. Widow inherits. So at this point, a single woman could have inherited land, but she'd have to be the only heir, basically. And we know from some census records that we're going to look at in a second that this William and Elizabeth probably had numerous children. So there's really no reason for one of his daughters and a single daughter to inherit land from him. So this is almost certainly a widow, Elizabeth, listed here, that is being taxed for the same land. And then we know that between 1824 and 1829, Elizabeth dies, or she becomes too old to be taxed for it. But we think that the ownership has passed to her heir, and that would be a son. So Frederick would have to be really a son of this couple to inherit this land and to be taxed on it. Like this. This is, I mean, there could be maybe some far-fetched other explanation, but this is really the only thing that really makes sense. Now, we want to know more about this William Graves, and is he really older than the other William, my younger William Graves? So we can look at the 1810 census. It does exist for Kentucky, fortunately. And remember, this is in Warren County now because that's where that land was located. Name's been misspelled, but when you look at the original, it is Graves. And you can see that William is a male over 45 at this time period. So he is William. He's actually older than the other William Graves that I was looking at. The female over age 45 is Elizabeth, probably. And then there are 3 males that are 16 to 25. And one of those could be Frederick, who was born around 1791, and it would be 19 in this census. One of them could be William, the younger, or William Jr., born around 1784, 85. That's my ancestor. and one other son. Now, Jacob was already out of the house and married at this time period in 1810, so he would not be in the household with his parents unless he and his wife were living there with his parents, which I guess is a possibility. And when I look at the neighbors of this William Graves in Warren County, Kentucky, I notice a number of people listed who I know are fan club members of my Graveses from Sumner County. So I think I feel really good about this William Graves being related to my William. So what have we learned? I think we have figured that Frederick's parents, or at least Frederick's father, was William. Elizabeth could be a second wife. She doesn't necessarily have to be Frederick's birth mother, but she could be. We don't know. But I think we've proven that Frederick's father was William the older, and we've definitely shown that the two men, William the younger and Frederick, were probably brothers. They were definitely associated. And we also have done Y-DNA, which is another piece of evidence. We have DNA tested male descendants of the three brothers. So Frederick, Jacob, and William the younger, and they do match each other. So this would indicate they have a common paternal ancestor. And given that William is the only older Graves, the only older Graves male in that area who could be their father, I think it's pretty likely that he was. Now, it would be great to get some more pieces of evidence, but I really think that I could probably write a genealogical proof argument for this relationship. And sometimes when you start writing your genealogical proof argument, you start noticing some holes in your research and you decide you want to do more research. So it's possible that when I start writing out my proofs and my arguments that I will think to myself, oh, maybe I haven't quite proved this yet. It would be great to find another of the siblings. If I could tie Jacob to this couple, to William and Elizabeth. I haven't been able to yet, definitively. The Byrne Courthouse is a problem there in Allen County for finding records. So there's possibly more that could be done, but this is, I think, a pretty good start. So I hope that helps you in just kind of seeing how you would want to follow the different records through and make a proof argument about these relationships. Okay, let's move on to our third case study. And this, again, is not a case study involving my family. I distinctly remember the gentleman who was researching this fellow, Barkley Scott, because Barkley Scott is such an uncommon name. And you could see that he lived into the 20th century. And so he should have been relatively easy to research, right? Wrong. So this is what the patron who came in told me. He basically said, Barkley Scott shows up in Iowa as an adult in 1895. He's supposedly born around 1858 in Ohio. He gets married in Iowa twice, in 1904 and 1911. And the marriage records do indicate who his parents were, but they're kind of unclear. Both marriage records agree that the first names of his parents were David and Elizabeth. But the last name was unclear. In one of the marriage record, it said that David was named Scott. And in the other marriage record, it said Elizabeth was named Scott. So is Elizabeth's maiden name Scott, or is the father actually David Scott? A little bit unclear. But regardless, when the patron had looked, and I kind of did some cursory searching myself for parents of that name, David and Elizabeth Scott, in Iowa, in Ohio, around the right time frame, possible parents, we found some people of those names, but they seem to have a whole different other list of children. No Barkley listed with them, or any, near variation of Barkley. And so it was very mysterious. And so again, the patron said, I can't find Barkley on any census prior to 1895. And this is very curious, isn't it? And then the patron showed me a death certificate for Barkley. And what it said under the name of the deceased, it said his name was Barkley Scott. But then across the margin, over to the side, there were the words AKA Barkley Early Wine. And so AKA is an abbreviation that stands for also known as. And so it's implying that Barkley used two different surnames. And I asked the fellow about that, and he really didn't have any ideas for me. He just looked at me and he's like, is that relevant? And I'm like, yeah, this is kind of a big deal. So are we dealing with a name change for some reason? And people have lots of reasons for changing their names. Are we dealing with an adoption of some sort? Are we dealing with, some other mystery? We don't know. So just kind of tuck that other name in the back of your mind there. So I told the guy, I said, well, I'm going to give you my standard advice, which is, you got him in 1895. That's the first time you can find him in Boone County, Iowa, in a census. It's a state census for Iowa. And he's actually living with another family. And then he stays in Boone County, Iowa until he dies in 1934. I said, you got to do two things. One of them is you're going to do a deep dive into Barkley's life and the two wives and all the children and the in-laws and the fan club of what's going on there in Boone County, Iowa. And you're going to hope to find some kind of clue that leads you back to a birthplace in Ohio and who his birth family might have been, where he came from. I have put up on the slide, and I can see that it's very faint and you probably can't read it, but the census from 1895 in Boone County. And it's showing Joshua McLernan, age 63, and Margaret, his wife, aged 59, perhaps. And they are both born in Ohio, as was Barkley. So I point this out to the guy and I say to him, I'm really interested in this couple. Why is Barkley living with them in this 1895 census? He's 37 years old. Why is he living with another family? And the guy says, oh, he's their hired man. And I think it said that under occupation. I said, okay, all right. But you notice they're all from Ohio. I said, what if this McLernan family is some kind of relative of Barkley's? Could be an aunt, an uncle, might even be his mother, even though we have the mother's name as Elizabeth. Maybe this is really, his mother's really Margaret for some reason. I don't know. Have you looked into that? And I said that to him. And he said, that's where I would start. I would start with looking at some of the associated families with Barkley and see if you can find a connection. And he said, no, he's just the hired man. Okay. So then the guy goes over, I give him some things to do. He goes over, he starts working at a table. I work with some other people. I get interested in this again later in the day, but the guy's gone home. And so I didn't get his contact information. I felt bad about it ever since. But anyways, I decided to do a little more research on my own because I just thought, this is really interesting. And I'm going to start with this McLernan couple because I really had a hunch that this was going to go somewhere. So I type in, Joshua McLernan, Margaret McLernan in Boone County. And one of the first things that comes up is a find a grave. And what does this say? This says that, well, first of all, this is a great find a grave. Somebody has posted up a photograph of Margaret so you can see what she looks like. You can see the photograph of the tombstone as well. Somebody has typed in a transcription of her obituary that was in the newspaper. They put a citation on there so you can find it again. And they've put on her maiden name. And can you see what her maiden name is? It's Scott. So I don't know if the patron misunderstood me when I asked him if he looked into this couple or what, but it really took me like a couple minutes of putting in these names into a search, into a search box in a database, an online database, to find that the family that Barkley was living with in 1895 in Iowa had somebody, was with a relative. He was related to them somehow, probably to Margaret. This obituary also tells us that where Margaret was born in Ohio. It says Knox County, Ohio, and said she was born around 1835. So the next thing I did was I went to the census for 1850 for Knox County, Ohio, looking for a Margaret Scott who was age 15. And there was only one person that popped up that was anywhere near the right age. And it's this person here. And so she's living with a household headed by a Mary Scott, probably her mother, probably her widowed mother, and a number of brothers and sisters, or probable brothers and sisters. And one of them is Elizabeth Scott. Now, there could be a brother David who's not listed in the household, so we don't know that yet. But this Elizabeth, I thought, was worth looking at because we had the information that Barkley's mother was named Elizabeth. So then I changed my search and I started searching Elizabeth Scott in 1850 in Knox County, Ohio. And what came up electrified me. So remember that Barkley's 2 marriage records agreed that his parents' first names were David and Elizabeth. They disagreed on whether the father's last name was Scott or the mother's last name was Scott. And remember that his death certificate said that he was also known as Barkley Earlywine. So this record here ties together all 4 of those names very neatly. David Earlywine, Elizabeth Scott of Knox County, Ohio, got married in 1856. This would be approximately 2 years before Barkley's death, or Barkley's birth, sorry about that. So this would work out perfectly. So what happened then? So then I start researching David Earlywine, and I find him in the 1860 census, and he doesn't have Elizabeth or Barkley with him. And he soon remarries. And so this leads to, questions about what's happened to Elizabeth, what's happened to Barkley. So I do searching for Elizabeth Earlywine, and I'm hoping to find a grave. But as you may know, certainly not every gravesite and burial place in the United States is on Find a Grave. And so I didn't find anything. So I went and looked at our cemetery book, which is a print book, an actual physical book for Knox County, Ohio. And I found a sad listing for Elizabeth Earlywine, wife of David, dying at age 19. And so this would make her dying around age 1858 or 59, which leads me to wonder whether she might have died in childbirth. Now, it would be very typical in this time period for a male widower who is left with an infant child to give that child to somebody else to raise, or at least to help him with the child at first. He was in no position to nurse the child, obviously. He had to work all day. He couldn't hire a babysitter per se. So this would be very typical, and it would not necessarily mean that he didn't care about the child. He was trying to help the child as best he could by giving it a better life, by putting it with somebody who could take care of the child better than he could. So with that in mind, I started looking around for where Barkley might have been in 1860. He was not with the McLernans. But when I go to his grandma's census entry, here's Grandma Mary Scott. She's the mother of Elizabeth and Margaret, and she has a daughter, Anne, with her. And she also has a child that is 2 years old, a male child that's 2 years old, and it says Bartlett Scott. And I wonder if the census taker just made a mistake here, or maybe they didn't hear correctly what the family was saying. But I believe this is Barkley. There's no other Bartlett Scott that has been associated with this family. And so he doesn't appear to be a real person, but Barkley Scott, as we know, would have been 2 years old at this time period. And so I believe that's him. Once we found out that his name was also Barkley Earlywine, we did find him in the 1880 census. He's living with the McLernans in Iowa already, and he is listed as their nephew. And so that clearly states the relationship there. We never found him in 1870. We don't know exactly where he was at that point in time. So have we proven that David and Elizabeth were his parents? Yes, I think so. I think you could write a convincing proof argument about this case, although it had many twists and turns. To wrap up some of the loose ends, there may be some records there in Ohio, in Knox County, Ohio, detailing more about what happened after Elizabeth died. We don't know exactly why he took his mother's family's name. Was it because they raised him, or was it because there was an estrangement or another kind of hard situation between him and the early wine side of his family? So some things to look for, maybe a guardianship record, some probate records, his father David's will or probate, some court records. Was there a custody battle, an inheritance dispute? Newspaper articles, if there was something really scandalous going on, it could have been reported in the local newspapers, and so on and so forth. So that is our final case study. So in conclusion, just again, once you have gathered your indirect evidence, you're going to use the genealogical proof standard to formulate your argument and lay out the proof that you have identified the parents of your ancestor. And you might want to look at the Tom Jones book, which is in your handout, called Mastering Genealogical Proof. This goes into great detail about how to do basically what we talked about today. And then these books are also in your handout, so you can look at those. These are more about genealogy in general if you need some good basic grounding in genealogical research principles. See you later.